Waterford Wesleyan Church Online. My name is Pastor Matt. I'm the assistant pastor here at Waterford Wesleyan Church. We've just got three quick announcements for you before we get going into today's message. And the first is this. April 9th, 11 a.m., across the street at the park, we are having our Easter egg hunt. We're back. Over COVID, we took a little break, and we are back in the year 2022. Again, that is April 9th, here at the park, here at the church, 11 a.m. That's a Saturday. We hope to see you there. Second announcement is this. If you are a woman and you are available April 30th at 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., we are having a women's event here at the church called Every Mile Mattered, talking about and discussing how you can tell your story wherever you are in your walk with Christ. And if you want to register for that, you need to text the word MILE to 518-223-8662, or you can go on our website and register there. Again, that is here at the church, 5:30 to 7:30 on April 30th. We hope to see you there. Next announcement is this. The world is a little crazy, especially in the country of Ukraine, and we here at the Wesleyan Church, our whole denomination, has initiated our Wesleyan Emergency Relief Fund, or WERF, if you want to remember it that way. And if you want to be able to give to that, those funds go directly from you to WERF to the Ukrainian people to help in that capacity. And if you want to be able to give to that, you can go to wesleyan.org, and at the very top of the screen, there's a banner where you can give to that organization. So, with all of that out of the way, here is Pastor Paul.
Today, I'm going to share with you a message that has been rolling around in my mind for 15 years. And no, I'm not exaggerating. It was 15 years ago I heard this message preached, and it is one of those that actually changed me. It changed the way I approach people and handle my relationships. You see, in this life, and no matter how long you've been a follower of Jesus, when you go to church or you listen to a sermon online, you probably can remember 3 of them. You know, that's about it. There's 1, 2, or 3 that radically changed who you are when you come to know Jesus, and then a few others here or there that reshape the way you live your life. And for me, what I'm going to share with you today is the one that changed the way I handle relationships, the way I handle conflicts, the way I handle disagreements with other people in my life. And I think even today, more than 15 years ago, this is going to be really helpful information, because we are not, as a society, we are not very good at handling disagreements or handling conflict. Many times what's happening today is we have just devolved into a place where I'm right, you're wrong, and if you don't agree with me, you're bad, and if you don't like what I have to say, then you must hate me. And it's just this really strange way that we could never have conversations with one another. And unfortunately, you get nowhere. And the reality is, as a follower of Jesus Christ, that can never be us. We can never just devolve into a camp that I'm right, I'm virtuous, you're bad, and you're wrong, and that's it. So we realize that we all have conflicts, and what I'm going to share with you today directly impacts the way that you will handle your conflicts with your coworkers, or maybe a sibling, or even your spouse or your friends, because we're not always going to agree. And so how do we move forward then, understanding the best way to come to some sort of agreement? And so we're going to work that out here today. So with all of that in mind and all of that hype, let's get right to the scripture that changed me some 15 years ago. And that's John chapter 1, beginning at verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John, meaning John the Baptist, testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he is before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." As amazing as everything that I just read there to you is, I mean, it's really profound things. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. It's kind of like make your brain melt a little bit if we word to unpack that, but just for time's sake, we're going to zero in and focus specifically on verse 14. And verse 14 says this. I want to share it with you one more time. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John tells us in this amazing, incredible reality that Jesus is God in flesh, and that John has seen it with his own eyes. I mean, that he's kind of holding on to that, and that is an amazing thing, no doubt. But what I want you to note is, with intentionality, he chooses to describe the fullness of Jesus with two words. And before we look at what those are, realize this. John could have said Jesus came from the Father full of power and might, forgiveness and restoration. He came from the Father full of mercy and love. I mean, there's all kinds of things that he could have said he came from the Father filled with, but he chose with specificity grace and truth. And so when I pause on that and I think about that, why would he pick those two words out of all of the other words that he could have used? Power and might, forgiveness and hope, and all of these other ones that are accurate. He chose, with intentionality, grace and truth. Why? I mean, why would that be? And so as I begin to think that all the way through, I'm like, well, what is Jesus' goal? And in what the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Colossae kind of gives us some insight into that. And I want to share that with you too. This is Colossians chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. The scripture says this: "For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation." The fullness of God, Paul tells us, what that does is it reconciles. It restores relationships between people and God. Once you were an enemy of God because of your evil behavior, Jesus came and bridged the gap between evil humanity and a sinless God. So when I think about the fullness of God dwelling in Jesus, then what John says, he came from the Father full of grace and truth, and what he did in that is he reconciled people to God. So when I realized why John picks those two words, it's about reconciliation. It's about when you have a disagreement with somebody, how you can go and handle that properly to restore that relationship, because this is exactly what Jesus did for you and for me by coming and living among us and living a sinless life, dying on the cross and being raised again to life. This is the essence of who Jesus is, and he is full of God's fullness, I guess is one way to say it. And John tells us that is grace and truth. The fullness of God brings reconciliation. So when I think about my own life and the conflicts or the disagreements that I may have with other people or they may have with me, it seems very reasonable to me then, if I want to see restoration and reconciliation in them, then I need to apply that same principle, that same understanding. The fullness of God dwelling in me would be then living out grace and truth. For the great reconciler who bridged the gap between sinful man and himself, perfect, holy God, was full of grace and truth. So, properly applied, then of course, if I apply that in my own life, we can handle simple disagreements, squabbles, or even maybe differing political views. That can all be handled properly when we apply grace and truth. Because if it restored broken humanity to a sinless God and perfect God, then yeah, I think it can handle my petty squabbles with others, and likewise for you as well. So, Jesus came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He's full of it. Full of what? Jesus is full of grace. Well, what is grace? We need to define this. If we're going to say I need to apply this to the conflicts and disagreements I have in my life, then we need to know what grace is. So if you were to pop open a book on theology and it would find out what grace is, it would say it's unmerited favor. Well, and to me, that doesn't help a whole lot. What in the world is unmerited favor? I'll make it even simpler. Grace is giving somebody something you don't think they deserve. Here's an example. You go to work tomorrow and somebody steals your pen. One of your coworkers steals your pen or steals your lunch, right? And you take it out of the fridge and they eat it on you. And you're like, hey, what about that? Mercy would be not reporting them to your boss. Grace would be going and buying them lunch or going and buying them a pen. Grace is giving somebody something you don't think they deserve. And they may very well not deserve it. But that is grace. It's above mercy. It's even further along. So when you think about it this way, when you're talking about disagreements and conflicts, giving somebody grace is what? I would start with saying this: giving them the benefit of the doubt. Giving them your ear, listening to what they have to say. You might say it doesn't matter. Their opinion is terrible. You don't understand where they're coming from. That's not what I'm saying. That would be just writing them off. I'm saying grace. Grace says, I'm going to listen. I'm not going to decide what they are or are not going to say. Because when I don't lead with grace, it usually doesn't work out so well. Because what happens is if most of the time in that conflict, if I'm just trying to figure out what I'm going to say to somebody to defend my position, it usually doesn't work out so well for me. I might win the argument, I might win the conflict, but lose the relationship. And I can tell you what, that's never worth it. And think about it this way. You may know, or it may be you. You know people that have not talked to their siblings, that have not talked to their parents, their old friends, because they disagree politically. Or you may have those that have not spoke and they don't even remember why they stopped speaking. When you're only trying to defend your position, it just never works out that well. You may win the conflict, but and win the argument, but you lose the person. So next time, try grace. You may not be able to go back and restore that one, but the next time you have a conflict or a disagreement with somebody, try grace. And grace is giving them something you don't think they deserve. And what that very well may be is give them the benefit of the doubt. And what that means in practice then is to just simply listen to them. Have some empathy for them. Listen to their perspective. Listen to why they're coming from, how they got there. Actually listen. Don't just spend your time figuring out how you're going to have a rebuttal or defend your position. Listen to what they are saying. Put yourself in their shoes. You go, wow, they don't deserve that. Right, that's grace. Exactly. Listen to what they're sharing with you. James says it to us this way in James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Very simply put, what James is telling us is we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. And grace is extending that to other people. Listen to them. Listen to where they're coming from and again, how they got there. And it's amazing what happens when you put yourself in their shoes. You may just learn something. Because what it does for you is it expands your view. They may share something that you've never thought about before or never saw it through that angle before, because they have different life experiences. They have different things that you have never experienced. They may open your mind a little bit. Grace, what it does for you, helps you see things bigger, but what it does for them is it puts their defenses down. If you will give somebody and you'll listen to them, and they then know that you care, they're going to be much more apt to listen to you when you share your perspective in the conflict or the disagreement. We desperately need grace in our conflicts in our world today. So grace, Jesus is full of it. In conflict, lead with grace and a whole lot of it. Now, we don't end there. It's not just leading with grace. There's something that has to follow it. And what follows it is this. Jesus is not only full of grace, but he's also full of truth. And it's important that we approach our conflicts and disagreements in this order. Leading with grace and then following with truth. So truth. What is truth? That's a great question. As a society, that's getting blurrier all the time. I mean, think about it this way. We spent a couple videos ago talking about mis, dis, and malinformation that we tell ourselves, how we lie and deceive ourselves. But we got those terms because our society's words are often false. And so we're creating words to clarify what deceptions we are being fed and what deceptions that we are working out. And we have trouble now believing anything that we hear. Or at least I do. Oftentimes I take this position when I hear something, I sit back and wait and go, well, I'll just filter that through the wait and see program and see if it turns out to be true. This is the culture we live in, and it's a difficult place to be when you start to try to get to truth. So much so that we now have truth fact checkers, and we find out that fact checkers aren't even all that truthful to begin with. So now what? You just kind of go, what am I supposed to do with all of that? Anyway, truth. For our culture and our society, it's a moving target. So what is truth? Well, I'll tell you what truth is. Jesus Christ. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the essence of truth. There is no other truth other than Christ. And if you follow Jesus, he ultimately is the truth that will bring clarity to your life. It will bring clarity to your disagreements. It will bring clarity to actually who you are as a person. So, approaching disagreements or conflict with grace and then leading with truth. What does that look like? Truth is when you share your truth. Now, I don't mean truth is relative, that, I have my truth, man, you have yours. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you come into a conflict, there's always 2 points of view. The other person and yours. Your point of view, your perspective, where you're coming from, rooted in honesty and forgiveness of who Christ is in your life. Checking your heart first with him and then sharing your heart. That is truth. So, back to the conflict. Back to the grace and truth. Telling the other person why you think, how you think, and how you came to that conclusion. Rooted in a biblical perspective. Rooted in, again, like honesty, truth, forgiveness. Rooted in Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. That's sharing your perspective as well. You see, where we get in trouble in conflict is oftentimes we lead with truth. And that usually doesn't work so well. I mean, think about it this way. Truth comes across cold and hard. If I just tell you the truth, it may put you on the defense. I mean, have you ever been in those encounters where you meet somebody and they're like, you're going to turn to Jesus or you're going to burn in hell? And you're like, hey, that's wonderful. Let's hug. I mean, that is not very engaging. It's actually, you build a wall. As soon as somebody says something to you like that, you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Or here, how about it this way? And this is probably going to like edge you a little bit. If I said to you, well, you've lied. And you go, whoa, wait a minute. But you have. We've all bent the truth. So that's true to say, well, you've lied. I've lied. That's truth. But as soon as I say that to you, or I even say it to myself, a wall comes up and you're like, boom, you go on the defensive right away. So when you lead with truth, it tends to put people on the defense and they're not going to listen any longer. And reconciliation becomes harder and harder to achieve. That's why it's so critical to lead with grace and follow it with truth. And we must marry those two together. They cannot be separated, and you must lead with grace in these conflicts. Grace alone. If we only lead with grace and don't ever follow it up with truth, it's just like politeness. And that wears off pretty quick. And truth alone is just cold and hard. But marrying them together brings us to the place of a wonderful opportunity of reconciliation when you have a disagreement or a conflict with another person. Now, one final note, we tend to approach conflicts with one or the other, with grace or with truth. I often say it this way, you're probably a gracer or you're a truther. And it's oftentimes, and this is only my opinion, but it's oftentimes the way you see God is the way you will approach these conflicts. So if you see God as a righteous judge, you're probably going to approach people with truth first. Or if you primarily see God as a grandpa sitting on a porch sipping sweet tea, then you're probably going to approach God or approach conflicts with grace. You want to give people the benefit of the doubt. You're always kind of working things that way. And they must be married together because Jesus came from the Father, not just full of grace, not just truth, but grace and truth, and in that order. You have a tendency to lead with one or the other and pay attention to which one you tend to lead with, and that'll help you as you move forward. If you lead only with grace, and what happens is it's politeness, you never really share your perspective and you feel like you just get walked on all the time, and you build a little bit of resentment because you're always giving everybody else the benefit of the doubt and they're just stepping all over you in these conflicts. Or if you lead with truth, then what tends to happen is, well, you put everybody on the defense and you kind of get nowhere. You might win the argument, but you lose the relationship. So if the goal in your life is reconciliation, then follow what Jesus is all about, grace and truth, because he is the great reconciler that reconciled broken, sinful people to a holy and perfect God, and he is full of grace and truth. So for you and for me, we need to be filled with grace and truth just the same. You might say, well, that's a really tall order. It is, But Peter tells us this. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 says, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." Following in his steps is living out grace and truth, again, in that order, to bring reconciliation, to bring wholeness to those disagreements, to those conflicts that you have with people. They could be really significant disagreements and conflicts. They could be over even silly things. But either way, when you approach your conflicts, your disagreements, leading with grace, following it with truth, not only will you find that you restore relationships, but you will feel better when you handle them, and those relationships then can grow. Again, Jesus restored broken, sinful people to a perfect and holy God, full of grace and truth. And if we apply that in our own lives and we follow Jesus in our disagreements and our conflicts, he will bring restoration and healing to yours.